Well, this second devotional for Saturday, October the 29th, is continuing, but now the focus is upon Romans chapter 1, and I'm given a subtitle to the first half of that chapter, The Judgment of God. Now, a little bit of the background. Paul opens his epistle to believers in Rome with a salutation that declared right from the onset that he was the author, and his letter was addressed to the saints living in Rome. Now, lest some have a misunderstanding regarding the identity of the believers in Rome in Paul's day, allow me to state unequivocally that they were not members of an early version of the Roman Catholic Church. Roman Catholicism, a blend of various elements of ancient paganism and traditions, is a gross departure from sola scriptura, meaning the scriptures are the supreme authority of the church and believers in all matters of faith and practice. Obviously, the Roman Catholic Church follows tradition, but true Bible believers, including those of Paul's day, believed the scriptures were infallible, but human authority was fallible and weak. Well, the epistle to the believers in Rome was received by men and women whose confidence in their salvation was not predicated upon rituals and traditions, but upon the sincere, unadulterated scriptures. The gospel which Paul was called to preach was declared first, we read in verse 2, by the prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Well, what were those? Those were the Old Testament. The New Testament Scriptures were not yet penned and fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So Romans chapter 1 presents a familiar pastoral affection that we have seen Paul express in earlier epistles, and it was repeated in his letter to believers in Rome, verses 7 through 12. And so Paul, evoking an affirmation of God's love for believers, writing in verse 7, beloved of God and called to be saints, he stated his longing to visit them, whose faith, he writes, of the believers of Rome, whose faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. That is the world of Paul's day. Now, that is going to bring us to the second emphasis of our study. And I've titled this, A World Gone Mad, the Tragedy of Moral Depravity. And I'm going to invite you, as we look at the scriptures now, if you would begin considering Paul's expression of love. Now, verses 12 through 14, he had expressed his longing to come to Rome and to visit with those believers and to fellowship and minister with them, but he had been prevented. And we read in verse 15 through 16 his loving assurance to them. Verse 15, he writes, so as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. And then he continues, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Now listen, Paul was aware of the dark clouds of persecution that were already visible on the horizon in his day, and they would soon engulf the Roman Empire. Tens of thousands of believers would be sent to martyrs' deaths, and Paul felt an urgency to ground them in the faith. Now, I invite you to have your Bible open and follow with me, beginning at verse 18 of Romans chapter 1 and going through to the end. Now, between verses 18 and 21, we see what I am describing as the sin of man and the wrath of God. Now, we find in the balance of Romans a depth and a breadth of fundamental truths that humanity denies in our day but are universally shown. For instance, while men deny the evidences of the Creator and divine design, nature itself gives testimony of the handiwork of God. And therefore, Paul writes in verse 20, the invisible things of Him that is of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His, that is God's, eternal power and Godhead, so that they, that is men, are without excuse. Now, see, creation serves as a testimony of perfect design And yet man's sin and rebellion has introduced a chaotic, self-destructive state, provoked God's wrath against, and we read in verse 18, against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, we have not seen yet the depth of depravity to which men will go when they deny God and suppress righteousness and truth. And yet we are witnessing now in the 21st century a denial of the undeniable. An example, some of this generation would deny the biological evidences of two sexes. That is, that God created male and female. How foolish is that? And what is the lesson? Deny the Creator, and there is no end to man's wicked imaginations. Now notice with me in verse 21 through 22 what I would describe as an attitude of ingratitude. Now the hardness and darkness of men's heart is visible and undeniable in the world. And though the Creator is the source of life and well-being, man has rejected God and proposed an evolutionary process that has no scientific basis and is as rational and as foolish as it can be. In fact, imagine. Here we have an intricately designed world and universe, and to think that there is no designer, the thought is preposterous. Now, the concept of Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory would not be written until the late or after the mid-1800s. And yet Paul, as we look at verses 21 through 22, he diagnoses man's spiritual crisis. Writing to men in verse 21 and 22, they became vain in their imaginations and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. You know that the classrooms of schools and colleges and universities in the 21st centuries are instructed by men and women who imagine they are wise philosophers, lovers of wisdom. But God says that they are fools. Why are they fools? Because they have denied the Creator, and they are incapable of understanding truth or even making moral judgments. They fail, verse 22, to be able to discern between that which is good and that which is evil. Now that brings me to verse 23 through 27, what I would describe as the depth of depravity. Now, how foolish are men who deny the revelation of God in His creation? Well, in verse 23, in Paul's day, they worshiped nature. We read that they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and the birds, four-footed beasts, and creeping things. In other words, they worshiped that which was of their own creation. And what becomes of a world that rejects God as Creator? Well, we see the description of that beginning in verse 24. And we realize that there is no limit to the depths of moral depravity to which men will descend. In fact, men, as you look at verse 24, become slaves to sin. And they dishonor, that is, they shame their own bodies between themselves. Because they reject God's truth, they worship and they serve nature, as you look at verse 25. Rejecting the Creator and natural design, men and women turn to sodomy. We read in verse 26 through 27, the women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, contrary to nature, describing lesbianism. And likewise also the men, leaving or forsaking the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, describing the sin of sodomy or homosexuality. It goes on in verse 27, it says, men with men working or doing that which is unseemly, it's unshameful, it's indecent, and receiving in themselves that recompense, that penalty of their error, which was meet. In other words, man doing that which demanded the judgment of God. Well, closing thoughts, beginning in verse 28 and reading through verse 32, What a tragic portrait of man's rebellion is recorded here. Moral depravity. Man has cast aside the knowledge of his Creator, and God has abandoned him to destructive passions and lusts. I won't take the time to read them, but look at Romans chapter 1, verses 29 through 31, and you'll find there 23 signs or indications a man and a people have abandoned God. And tragically, all of those signs are evidence in our world and in our country. I close with this. According to verse 20 and verse 32 of Romans chapter 1, man is without excuse. In spite of having the judgment of God written upon his conscience, man not only continues in his sin, but we read in verse 32, he takes pleasure in watching others sin. Does that not describe the wickedness of our day? Stay with me in future devotions as we continue our journey through the doctrines of the book of Romans. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of the Heart of the Shepherd. Bye-bye.